In this mini lecture, we want to talk a little bit about one of the things that in the subdiscipline of comparative politics that we're going to need to understand, and that's democracy. It's one of the things that we know that can vary by state. So states can be more or less democratic, and it's one of the ways that we can compare states, right? Comparative politics. So in this little mini lecture, we want to chat about kind of just a couple of the elements of democracy. So what are the institutional structures that we see in democracies, and how can they look differently? Not every country is going to have identical looking democracies, and so the institutions that make up that state's democracy will look different based on the state. Now, for instance, one of the most common institutions that we'll take a look at are legislative branches and executive branches. And there's a couple of different ways these can look, but let's chat about what they are. A legislative branch is the branch that makes law. So it is the individuals who gather generally in some kind of parliament or Congress, and they make rulings about things, and they are going to create the law of the land for that particular country. Executives are, as the name might imply, they're kind of the presidents. They execute the law. So legislatures make law, and executives execute law. And the way you might have these or not have these will make democracies different. So some countries might have very big legislatures where executive power is actually inside the legislature. Other countries might separate legislative and executive power like we do in the United States. But there's lots of different ways that you might see this. Now, we'll take a look at the two major forms that we're going to see around the world. And the first is what we call parliamentarianism. In a parliament, you have a majoritarian form of government because you have all power concentrated in a single institution. So that means legislative power and executive power are in one branch, parliament. And so the executive power is what we call a prime minister, and that executive is part of the legislature. So in a parliamentary system, the prime among equals, the prime minister, is a member of parliament. So the legislature includes the executive. Now this is a little different for us because in the United States, we use a very different system. In the U.S., we have a presidential form of government, or what's called presidentialism. And this we talk about, which you're familiar with, which is separation of powers. That's where there's a president, and that's separated from a legislature, and oftentimes separated from a court system, although we won't spend much time talking about this. And so they have to, in some ways, coordinate their actions to get things done, because they're separate institutions. We call this a consensus version of democracy, in large part because all of these different groups have to at some point agree. In this case, presidents are the head of the state and government, but they are separated, as we already noted, from the legislature. So the legislature sits here, and the head of government sits over here as the president. Now, another way that democracies can look different is federalism. Federalism is the dividing of power among different levels of government. So, for instance, you might have a national government, but you would then also have constitutionally protected status for smaller sub-governmental units. The other possibility, which you've read and talked about, is you can have a unitary form of government. But nationalism is where there is power shared and divided among these units. In basic terms, we'll say that your kinds of democracies are you can have a unitary form of government or a federal form of government. And we'll be interested in what that federal system looks like. So you can have different distributions of power among the levels, right? How much power does the national get versus the subnational units get? Devolution refers to a trend that occurs when the subunits start getting more and more power relative to the national government. But we have all kinds of terms like symmetrical and asymmetrical to talk about how much power flows between these units in a federal system. In a really basic way, parliamentarism, presidentialism, and federal versus unitary are going to be some of the basic institutions that you'll deal with in comparative politics.